David Sullivan flew halfway around the world to marry the Filipina nurse who'd stolen his heart through late-night video calls. But the woman waiting at the airport had eyes that held secrets darker than he could imagine. What he discovered in the cramped apartments and shadowy streets of Cebu City would transform his dream of eternal love into a nightmare that threatened not just his heart, but his life. David's hands shook as he read the message that would change everything. "My mother is dying, and I need $500 for her medicine." The notification glowed on his phone at 3 a.m., pulling him from restless sleep in his empty Chicago apartment. For 6 months, Isabella Santos had been his lifeline, a beautiful nurse from the Philippines who called him "my king" and promised to build a life together in America. The 45-year-old construction worker stared at her photo on his nightstand. Dark eyes sparkled beneath perfect eyebrows, and her smile seemed to reach right through the glass to touch his lonely heart. He'd never had luck with women. His ex-wife Sarah had left him 3 years ago, taking half his savings and calling him boring on her way out the door. Isabella was different. She listened to his problems after long workdays. She laughed at his jokes. She made him feel like a man worth loving. Their love story began on a dating app called Asian Hearts Connect. David had scrolled through hundreds of profiles before Isabella's caught his attention. Her bio read, "Nurse seeking serious relationship. Family is everything to me. Looking for honest man to share dreams with." Unlike other women who ignored his messages, Isabella responded within hours. "Hello, handsome. I see your kind eyes in your photo," she wrote. "Tell me about your dreams." Their first video call lasted 4 hours. Isabella sat in what looked like a small apartment, wearing scrubs from her hospital job. Behind her, medical textbooks filled a wooden shelf. She spoke with a sweet accent, stumbling occasionally over English words in a way that made David's chest warm with protective feelings. "I work very hard at the hospital," she explained, tucking a strand of black hair behind her ear. "But I dream of coming to America, to start a family with good man like you." David found himself opening up about things he'd never told anyone. His fear of growing old alone. His regret about not having children. His worry that he wasn't smart enough or rich enough to deserve love. Isabella listened to every word, her eyes full of understanding. "You have beautiful heart, David," she whispered. "I can see it." As weeks passed, their connection deepened. Isabella would call him during her hospital breaks, sometimes looking tired from long shifts. She sent photos of Filipino food she cooked, asking if he would like to try it someday. She talked about her sick mother, who needed expensive treatments that her nurse salary couldn't cover. David started sending money without Isabella even asking. First $200 for her mother's medicine, then $300 for food when Isabella mentioned being hungry at work. When she cried during a video call about not having enough money for rent, David sent $800 without hesitation. "You are angel sent from heaven," Isabella sobbed with gratitude. "I love you so much, my king." But strange things began happening. Sometimes Isabella's internet would cut out during important conversations. Her English became perfect when she got excited, then broken again when she remembered to sound less educated. Most puzzling of all, she always had excuses for why they couldn't meet in person. "My passport is expired," she explained when David offered to visit. "It takes months to renew in Philippines." "I will come to you," David insisted. "I don't care about passports." Isabella's face went pale on the video screen. No, it's too dangerous for American in my city. Much crime. You wait for me to come to America, okay." Red flags started waving in David's mind, but love made him ignore them. He wanted to believe in their fairy tale romance. He needed it to be real. The breaking point came when David's coworker Jake looked over his shoulder at Isabella's photos. "Dude, that's a model from Instagram," Jake said, squinting at the screen. "I've seen her picture on like 10 different profiles." David's world tilted sideways. That night, he confronted Isabella during their video call. "Jake says your photos are fake," he said, studying her face for any sign of deception. Isabella's eyes filled with tears. "How can you say this? I send you real photos of me cooking, of me at work. You think I'm a liar?" She looked so hurt, so genuine, that David immediately felt guilty for doubting her. But deep in his gut, something twisted with unease. Love and suspicion battled in his chest as he realized he had to know the truth. Days turned into weeks as David wrestled with his doubts. He started paying closer attention to details during their video calls. Isabella's apartment seemed to change layouts between conversations. Sometimes her bookshelf was on the left side of the screen, other times on the right. When he mentioned this, she laughed it off. "I rearrange furniture when I am bored," she said with a giggle that sounded forced. Filipino women like to keep things fresh. David began taking screenshots during their calls, studying them later like a detective examining evidence. In one photo, Isabella wore a hospital ID badge, but the picture was too blurry to read. In another, medical equipment sat in the background, but it looked old and dusty, as if it hadn't been used in years. His co-worker Jake became more suspicious as weeks passed. During lunch breaks at the construction site, Jake would shake his head as David showed him new photos Isabella had sent. "Brother, something ain't right," Jake said one day, biting into his sandwich. "Real nurses don't have time to send 20 selfies a day. My sister's a nurse, and she barely has time to call her mom." David's defensive anger surprised even himself. "You don't know Isabella like I do. She cares about me. How much money have you sent her?" Jake asked quietly. The question hit David like a punch to the gut. He'd never added up the total, but as he mentally calculated, his stomach sank. $2,000 over 6 months. Money he'd saved for a new truck for home repairs for his future. All of it gone to a woman he'd never touched, never held, never even met in person. That night, David did something he'd been avoiding. He created a fake profile on the same dating app where he'd met Isabella, using a stock photo of a handsome young man. Within hours, he'd found 3 different women using Isabella's exact photos, all claiming to be nurses from different cities in the Philippines. His hands trembled as he compared the profiles. Same photos, different names, different stories. One claimed to be a single mother. Another said she was an orphan. The third mentioned a sick grandmother instead of a mother. David's world crumbled around him. Everything Isabella had told him, every sweet word, every promise of forever, all of it was a lie. He was just one of many lonely men being played by someone who saw him as nothing more than a walking wallet. But anger mixed with something else, concern. During their next video call, David studied Isabella's face more carefully. Behind the practiced smiles and rehearsed endearments, he saw exhaustion. Dark shadows under her eyes suggested she wasn't sleeping well. Her apartment, while clean, showed signs of poverty, thin walls, a single electric fan, furniture that looked like it came from yard sales. "Isabella," he said during a pause in their conversation, "are you okay? You look tired." For a moment, her mask slipped. Real emotion flickered across her features. Fear, sadness, something that looked almost like relief that someone had noticed her pain. "I'm just working many hours," she said quickly, the practiced smile returning. "Hospital is very busy this month." But David had seen something genuine in that unguarded moment. Whatever game Isabella was playing, she might not be the one calling the shots. Someone else might be pulling the strings, using her just as she was using him. The realization didn't make the betrayal hurt less, but it added complexity to his anger. Was Isabella a victim too, or was she a master manipulator who'd learned to fake vulnerability? The only way to know for sure was to see her face to face, to look into her eyes without the safety barrier of a computer screen between them. David's hands shook as he opened his laptop and searched for flights to Manila. Love, anger, and curiosity battled in his chest as he typed in his credit card information. He was either about to save the woman he loved or confront the person who'd stolen his heart and his money. Either way, the truth was waiting for him on the other side of the world. The next morning, David bought a plane ticket to the Philippines. The moment David's feet touched the ground at Ninoy Aquino International Airport in Manila, he knew something was terribly wrong. The woman holding the sign with his name looked nothing like Isabella's photos. She was shorter, older, with tired eyes and nervous energy that made her fidget with her phone. "David, I am Carmen, Isabella's friend," she said in accented English. "Isabella is very sick today. She sent me to pick you up. David's stomach dropped. After 18 hours of travel and months of planning, Isabella wasn't even there to meet him. Carmen led him through crowded streets filled with jeepneys and motorcycle taxis, the humid air thick with exhaust fumes and cooking food smells. "Where is Isabella's hospital?" David asked as they rode in a rusty taxi toward the city center. Carmen avoided his eyes. She worked different hospital now. New job. Very busy. The hotel Carmen brought him to was nothing like the nice place Isabella had recommended. Paint peeled from the walls, and the air conditioner made grinding noises that kept David awake all night. When he finally managed to video call Isabella, her face appeared pixelated and strange on his phone screen. "My love, you made it safe," she exclaimed, but something felt off about her enthusiasm. "I'm so sorry I could not meet you. I have terrible flu. Doctor says I cannot leave bed for 3 days. I'll come take care of you," David offered immediately. "No, it's too dangerous. You might get sick too. Carmen will show you around Manila until I feel better." For 3 days, Carmen dragged David to tourist spots while he grew more frustrated and suspicious. At Rizal Park, she kept checking her phone and whispering to people in Tagalog. At the Mall of Asia, she insisted on taking his photo in front of every store, as if documenting his visit for someone else. On the 4th day, David had enough. He slipped away from Carmen while she was distracted at a souvenir shop and took a taxi to the address Isabella had given him months ago. His heart pounded as he climbed the narrow stairs of a run-down apartment building in a neighborhood that looked nothing like the clean hospital district Isabella had described. The woman who answered the door was definitely Isabella from the video calls, but seeing her in person shocked David to his core. She was thinner than her photos suggested, with dark circles under her eyes and a hardness to her expression that the camera had never captured. "David, what are you doing here?" Her voice carried panic instead of joy. "I came to surprise you," he said, pushing past her into the small apartment. "I was worried when you were sick." The apartment told a story that shattered every lie Isabella had carefully built. Instead of medical textbooks, the shelves held romance novels in Tagalog. Instead of nurse uniforms, makeup and wigs cluttered the dresser. Most shocking of all, a laptop sat open on the kitchen table, showing video chat windows with 3 different men. "Who are they?" David asked, pointing at the screen where other foreign men smiled and waved at women who weren't there. Isabella quickly slammed the laptop shut, but it was too late. David had seen enough to understand that he wasn't the only man in Isabella's life. He wasn't even the only man she was talking to at that exact moment. "You can explain," he said quietly, sinking into a plastic chair that creaked under his weight. Isabella stood in the doorway, trapped between truth and the elaborate web of lies she'd spun. For the first time since David had known her, she looked truly afraid. "It is not what you think," she whispered, but her voice lacked the conviction that had carried her through months of deception. Outside the window, Manila's traffic honked and rumbled, a soundtrack to David's crumbling world. He had traveled halfway around the globe for love, only to discover that love might have been the biggest lie of all. But something in Isabella's frightened eyes told him there was more to this story than simple greed. Something darker was happening here, and David was about to learn that being deceived was only the beginning of his nightmare. Blood dripped from David's split lip as he stumbled through the narrow alley behind Isabella's apartment building. 3 men in motorcycle jackets chasing him through the maze of Manila's back streets. He'd been in the Philippines for only a week, but already his safe little world had exploded into violence and terror he never saw coming. It started an hour earlier when Isabella finally broke down and told him the truth. Not just about the fake photos and multiple boyfriends, but about the man who controlled everything she did. "His name is Rico," she whispered, glancing nervously at the door as if he might walk in at any moment. "He owns me, David. He owns all of us." Isabella led him to the back bedroom of her apartment, where David discovered something that made his blood freeze. 3 other young women sat hunched over laptops, typing messages to foreign men on dating apps. Their faces showed the same exhaustion he'd noticed in Isabella's eyes, the look of people trapped in a situation they couldn't escape. "Meet Sarah," Jenny, and Marie, Isabella said quietly. They have American boyfriends, too. Lots of them. Sarah looked up from her screen, tears streaming down her cheeks. I haven't seen my real family in 2 years, she said in broken English. Rico says if I try to leave, he will hurt my little brother. David's mind reeled as he realized the scope of what he'd stumbled into. This wasn't just one woman scamming lonely men. This was an organized operation, and these women were prisoners, not criminals. How did you get involved in this? David asked Isabella, sinking into a plastic chair that had seen better days. Isabella's story unfolded like a nightmare. She'd come to Manila from her village looking for work, carrying dreams of becoming a real nurse. Rico found her at the bus station, hungry and alone, and offered her a job and a place to stay. By the time she realized what kind of work he expected, she was already trapped. He has photos of my family's house, Isabella explained, showing David pictures on her phone that made his stomach turn. He knows where my little sister goes to school. He says if I ever stop working or if I tell anyone about this, bad things will happen to them. The other women nodded, each carrying similar threats that kept them chained to their laptops, pretending to love men they'd never met. We tried to run away once, Jenny whispered. Rico found us before we got to the police station. He hurt Sarah really bad. Now we're too scared to try again. David felt sick as he understood how completely he'd been played. But more than that, he felt angry. These women weren't villains. They were victims of something much worse than he'd imagined. We have to call the police, David said, pulling out his phone. No, all 4 women said at once, panic filling their voices. You don't understand. Isabella grabbed his arm. Rico has friends in the police. They will just tell him what we said, and then... She didn't finish the sentence, but her terrified expression said everything. That's when they heard footsteps on the stairs outside. Heavy boots, multiple people, moving with purpose toward the apartment door. He's here, Sarah whispered, her face going white with terror. Isabella pushed David toward the back window. You have to go. Now, if Rico finds you here, he will kill you. I'm not leaving you, David said, but even as he spoke, he could hear men's voices in the hallway, speaking rapid Tagalog that sounded angry and threatening. Please, Isabella begged. If something happens to you, we will be blamed. Rico will punish all of us. The front door rattled as someone tested the lock. David had seconds to decide between his safety and theirs. Heart pounding, he squeezed through the narrow window onto the fire escape as the apartment door burst open behind him. He could hear Rico's voice now, cold, commanding, terrifying. The man spoke in English mixed with Tagalog, clearly angry about something. David caught fragments, American boyfriend, too many questions, problem needs solving. Climbing down the rusty fire escape, David's hand shook as he realized Rico knew about him. Somehow, the man had discovered that one of his workers had brought her foreign victim to the Philippines. And from the sound of his voice, Rico wasn't planning to let David leave Manila alive. David's feet hit the alley pavement just as the apartment window above exploded with shouting. He could hear Isabella crying, the other women pleading, and Rico's voice getting angrier by the second. That's when the back door of the building slammed open and 3 men in motorcycle jackets spotted him trying to hide behind a dumpster. There's the American, one of them shouted in English, clearly for David's benefit. David ran like his life depended on it, because he was starting to realize it probably did. Behind him, heavy footsteps pounded the pavement as Rico's men gave chase through the twisted streets of a city where David didn't speak the language, didn't know the rules, and was completely alone. His lungs burned as he dodged between vendors and motorcycles, the sounds of pursuit never falling far behind. In his pocket, his phone buzzed with a text message that made his blood run cold when he finally stopped to check it. We have your girlfriend and her friends. Come to Warehouse 47 in Port Area tonight at midnight, or they die. Come alone, bring $10,000 cash, no police. You caused this problem, now you fix it. David stared at the message, his hands trembling. He'd come to the Philippines looking for love and discovered something far more dangerous. Now 4 innocent women's lives hung in the balance, and he was the only one who could save them. But first, he had to survive the next 12 hours in a city where powerful people wanted him dead. Midnight approached like a death sentence as David crouched behind shipping containers in Manila's port area, clutching a backpack full of money he'd borrowed from every source he could find. The warehouse district stretched before him like a concrete jungle, filled with shadows where anything could happen to a lone American who'd stumbled into the wrong world. He'd spent the day in a desperate scramble to gather Rico's ransom money. His credit cards were maxed out from the plane ticket and hotel. His bank account held maybe $300. But desperation made David creative, and fear made him bold. First, he called his brother in Chicago, spinning a story about a medical emergency that needed immediate cash. Tom wired $2,000 without asking too many questions. Then David hit every pawn shop in Manila, selling his watch, his wedding ring from his failed marriage, even his construction boots. By evening, he'd scraped together $8,000. Not the full amount Rico demanded, but hopefully enough to negotiate. The warehouse ahead looked like something from a horror movie. Broken windows stared down like dead eyes, and rust stains on the metal walls looked like dried blood in the moonlight. David's stomach churned as he approached the side entrance, wondering if he was walking into a trap that would end with his body floating in Manila Bay. A single text message had guided him here. Door 3. Come alone. Hands where we can see them. David pushed open the heavy metal door and stepped into darkness that smelled of motor oil and fear. Fluorescent lights flickered overhead, casting harsh shadows that made everything look like a nightmare. In the center of the warehouse, 4 chairs sat under a bright spotlight, and David's heart nearly stopped when he saw who occupied them. Isabella, Sarah, Jenny, and Marie sat tied up, duct tape across their mouths, their eyes wide with terror above the silver strips. They looked like they'd been crying for hours, and David could see bruises on their arms that hadn't been there before. Right on time, Mr. American Hero, a voice said from the shadows. Rico stepped into the light, and David understood immediately why the women were so terrified of him. The man was built like a heavyweight boxer, with scars across his knuckles that suggested he'd used his fists to solve problems before. 2 other men flanked him, both carrying guns tucked into their waistbands. You brought my money? Rico asked, his English surprisingly good. David held up the backpack, his voice steadier than he felt. I brought what I could. $8,000. It's everything I have. Rico's laugh was cold as winter rain. Everything you have? Mr. David, you cost me much more than $8,000. These girls were making me good money until you came here asking questions. Let them go, David said, stepping closer despite every instinct screaming at him to run. This is between you and me now. You think this is a movie? You think you're a hero who saves the day. Rico shook his head. In real life, stupid Americans who stick their nose in other people's business just disappear. That's when David noticed something Rico hadn't seen. While the criminal had been talking, Marie had been working at the ropes around her wrists. Her hands were smaller than the others, and she'd managed to loosen the knots enough to slip one hand free. David needed to buy time and keep Rico's attention focused on him. These women have families, David said, loudly enough to cover any small sounds Marie might make. People who will ask questions if they disappear. Families who live in poor villages and believe whatever I tell them, Rico replied. Families who think their daughters moved to America with rich boyfriends. Behind Rico, Marie had freed both hands and was quietly working on the rope around her ankles. The other women watched with desperate hope as their friend inched closer to freedom. What do you want from me? David asked, taking another step forward. First, my money. All of it. Then, you disappear. Maybe you have an accident on the way to airport. Maybe you just never make it home to America. Depends on how much trouble you cause me. Rico nodded to one of his men, who started walking toward David with his hand on his gun. That's when Marie made her move. She sprang from her chair like a cat, diving for a rusty pipe that lay near the warehouse wall. But instead of using it as a weapon, she did something much smarter. She swung it hard at the main electrical box on the nearby wall. The warehouse plunged into total darkness as every light went out at once. In the confusion that followed, David heard chairs falling, men shouting in Tagalog, and the sound of running feet in all directions. Isabella, David yelled into the darkness. Where are you? Here. Her voice came from somewhere to his left. Follow my voice. David stumbled through the pitch-black warehouse, guided only by sound as chaos erupted around him. He could hear Rico screaming orders, his men bumping into equipment, and the blessed sound of the women freeing each other from their remaining bonds. A hand grabbed David's arm in the darkness. This way, Isabella whispered urgently. Marie knows a way out. They stumbled through the maze of the warehouse, following Marie's whispered directions toward a loading dock she'd spotted earlier. Behind them, Rico's voice grew more distant, but more furious. Find them. They cannot leave here alive. David's heart pounded as they reached the loading dock, where Marie was already pushing up a rolling door that led to the port beyond. Moonlight flooded in, and David could see freedom waiting just yards away. But as they prepared to run into the night, Isabella grabbed his arm one more time. David, she whispered urgently, there's something else you need to know about Rico. Something that makes him much more dangerous than you think. 3 months later, David sat in his small Chicago apartment, watching snow fall against the window where Isabella's photo used to stand. The space on his nightstand remained empty now, not from bitterness, but from a quiet understanding that some chapters close not with anger, but with acceptance. The morning light filtered through his kitchen window as he prepared coffee, his hands steady in a way they hadn't been for years. The simple ritual of grinding beans, measuring water, waiting for the brew to finish. These small moments had become anchors in his rebuilt life. He no longer reached for his phone every few minutes, no longer felt the desperate pull of digital validation that had once consumed his evenings. The events in Manila played in his memory like scenes from someone else's life. After Marie's brilliant blackout plan, they'd escaped Rico's warehouse and made it to the American embassy, where David learned the full scope of what they'd stumbled into. Rico wasn't just running a romance scam operation. He was connected to a larger trafficking network that moved women across Southeast Asia like commodities. Isabella's final revelation in that warehouse had changed everything. Rico had been planning to sell all 4 women to buyers in other countries once their online romance schemes stopped being profitable. David's arrival hadn't just disrupted a con game. It had interrupted something far more sinister. The embassy officials had been surprisingly thorough. Within days, Philippine authorities raided 3 more locations, freeing dozens of women who'd been trapped in similar situations. Rico and his associates now faced human trafficking charges that would keep them in prison for decades. David had testified via video conference from the safety of the embassy, his words helping to build the case that would finally bring justice to women who'd been silenced by fear for too long. But testifying wasn't the part that had changed him. It was the conversation he'd had with Isabella before leaving the Philippines. They'd sat in a small cafe near the embassy, 2 people who'd shared an intimate deception, now facing each other with complete honesty for the first time. Isabella looked different in the morning light. Younger, more fragile, but also stronger in ways that David was only beginning to understand. I want you to know something, she'd said, stirring sugar into her coffee with hands that no longer shook. When I first started talking to you, it was just another job, another lonely man to manipulate. But somewhere along the way, she paused, searching for words in her second language. You were kind to me, even when you didn't have to be, even when you thought I was lying. David had studied her face, looking for signs of another manipulation, another carefully crafted performance. But what he saw was simply exhaustion, the bone-deep weariness of someone who'd been performing for so long that she'd almost forgotten who she really was underneath. Were any of your feelings real? He'd asked, the question he'd been carrying since that first night in her apartment. Isabella had been quiet for a long moment, watching steam rise from her cup. I don't know anymore, she'd admitted. I learned to fake emotions so well that I stopped being able to tell the difference between what was real and what was performance. Maybe that's what this kind of life does to you. It makes you lose track of your own heart. That conversation had stayed with David through the long flight home, through the awkward explanations to family and friends, through the process of rebuilding a life that had been temporarily derailed by his search for connection. Now, months later, David understood that the real horror of his story wasn't being deceived by Isabella. It was how desperate he'd been to be deceived. How willing he'd been to ignore red flags, to send money to a stranger, to build his entire emotional world around someone he'd never met. The horror was recognizing how his own loneliness had made him vulnerable to exploitation, but understanding that vulnerability had become his strength. David had started volunteering at a local community center, helping teach English to immigrants and refugees. Many of them were women who'd escaped situations not unlike what Isabella had faced, trapped by circumstances, language barriers, and people who saw their desperation as an opportunity for profit. Working with these women had taught David something profound about resilience. They'd survived things that would have broken many people, yet they showed up every week to learn new words, to practice conversations, to build better lives one small step at a time. Their courage put his own struggles into perspective. His relationship with loneliness had changed too. The apartment that once felt like a prison now felt like a sanctuary. He'd learned to enjoy his own company, to find contentment in simple pleasures, a good book, a well-cooked meal, the satisfaction of work done well. The desperate edge of his solitude had softened into something more manageable, more honest. David still thought about love, about the possibility of sharing his life with someone. But his definition of love had evolved. Real love, he now understood, couldn't be built on desperation, his or anyone else's. It required two whole people choosing each other, not two broken heads trying to complete something that was missing inside themselves. He'd learned to recognize the difference between wanting to be needed and wanting to be loved. The David who'd fallen for Isabella's manipulation had wanted to be a savior, a provider, a solution to someone else's problems. The man he'd become wanted something more mutual, more balanced, a partnership built on honesty rather than rescue fantasies. Sometimes David wondered about Isabella and the other women they'd helped free from Rico's operation. The authorities had assured him they were safe, enrolled in programs to help trafficking survivors rebuild their lives. But he knew that recovery from that kind of trauma took time, patience, and resources that weren't always available. He hoped Isabella was learning to trust her own feelings again, to distinguish between performance and authenticity. He hoped she was discovering, as he had, that worth isn't determined by how desperately someone else needs you, but by the quiet strength you carry within yourself. The snow continued falling outside David's window, each flake unique, but part of something larger, more beautiful than any individual piece. He finished his coffee and prepared for another day. Not perfect, not dramatic, but genuinely his own. David had learned that the most profound transformations happen not in moments of crisis, but in the accumulation of small, honest choices made day after day. The choice to sit with loneliness without trying to escape it. The choice to help others without expecting to be healed by their gratitude. The choice to build a life based on what he could give to the world, not just what he hoped to receive from it. The horror story had become something else entirely, a quiet testament to the possibility of reclaiming yourself from your own worst impulses, of finding strength not in being loved, but in being worthy of love. Most importantly, it had taught him that the love worth having begins with the courage to face yourself honestly, flaws and all, and to build from that foundation rather than trying to fill an emptiness that only you can heal. Outside, the snow continued its gentle fall, covering the familiar streets of his neighborhood in pristine white. David watched it accumulate, understanding finally that some of life's most valuable lessons come disguised as failures, and that sometimes the greatest rescue is the one you perform on yourself.